Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton of Multipolarista, and today I have my close friend and colleague, Aaron Good. We're going to be talking about the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the very dangerous situation today. You could say we're probably closest in the past 60 years than ever to a potential nuclear war over the US slash NATO proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. So there's a lot to talk about there. But we also want to talk about the OPEC crisis in 1973, the OPEC oil embargo and the consequences of that, and the echoes that we see today with debt and with depreciating currencies against the US dollar and inflation and stagflation. So those are the two main topics that I wanted to talk about today. For people who don't know, Aaron is a brilliant historian and political economist. He has a PhD in political economy. And for people who don't know, in the description below, you can check out the series that I host with Aaron and his co-host, Seamus McGinnis. They are hosts of the podcast American Exception. And Aaron is the author of the book American Exception, Empire and the Deep State, which is a history of the U.S. empire and the U.S. deep state. So after this episode, you should check out that series. We have many different parts going through the history of the U.S. empire and deep state. But Aaron, let's talk about the threat of nuclear war today. It is quite scary. And in a second here, I want to show some of these media reports that show how dangerous the situation is. But you've done a lot of research on the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was, of course, in October of 1962. This is the 60th anniversary. And in school, I went to public school in the United States. We're often taught that this was a very dangerous moment. And of course, we're often taught that the Soviet Union was threatening the U.S. with these nuclear missiles in Cuba. Of course, they don't mention that the U.S. had actually deployed nuclear missiles to both Turkey and to Italy. That part is conveniently left out frequently in U.S. public schools, at least when I was taught it. It was all that the Soviet Union was the threat. And similarly today, we see a narrative that Russia is this evil boogeyman that is threatening the entire world over the proxy war in Ukraine. You and I have talked about the proxy war in Ukraine a lot. We can't understand this conflict unless we go back to 2014, when the U.S. government orchestrated a violent coup d'etat led by far-right extremist forces that overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, setting off a civil war from 2014 until Russia invaded in February of 2022. From 2014 until the end of 2021, according to the United Nations, more than 14,000 Ukrainians died, and the majority of civilian casualties were in Donbass. That is in the eastern region that was part of Ukraine. Now it was annexed by Russia after this democratic referendum. So we'll talk more about that. It's a very complicated story. But I just want to point out that this narrative that Russia is this evil boogeyman just threatening the world with nuclear war, nuclear apocalypse, is, of course, extremely facile. And it ignores comments that have been made from top U.S. officials that I want to highlight here that I think are very concerning and I think should provide context for our discussion today. Now, I want to give credit to Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com. He highlighted these comments that were made by one of the top U.S. military officials who specifically oversees nuclear forces. And his article is titled, "U.S. Nuclear Forces Chief Says the Big One is Coming." He's quoting comments from Navy Admiral Charles Richard, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command. Now, if people think that these comments are exaggerated because obviously this is antiwar.com, well, here is the official transcript from the Pentagon's website. So, after this video stream, I'm going to post in the description below an article at multipolarista.com with links to all of the articles that we talk about today. But here is the transcript from the U.S. Department of Defense website from November 3rd. And I'm going to read an exact quote here. It says, "The current conflict in Ukraine is not the worst that the U.S. should be prepared for. Around the corner," said the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, "the U.S. must be prepared for much more." And he said, quote, "This Ukraine crisis that we're in right now, this is just the warm-up. The big one is coming. And it isn't going to be very long before we're going to get tested in ways that we haven't been tested in a long time. Now, those are pretty scary comments. What is the big one? Well, it's not really that clear, but there are a few hints that maybe we can look at. So I just want to briefly here look at a few mainstream media reports about U.S. nuclear posturing. Here's a report in The Telegraph, a British conservative newspaper. U.S. to send high-tech nuclear weapons to NATO bases amid rising tensions with Russia. Deployment of B-61-12 tactical bombs to Europe comes after Moscow held military exercises showcasing its own ballistic capabilities. So, very concerning development. U.S. sending nuclear weapons to Europe. But that's just one of many reports here. Here's a report in Newsweek, again, another mainstream media outlet. Finland may allow NATO to place nuclear weapons on border with Russia. And when they say may, I mean, it's basically confirmed. Finland is joining NATO and has pretty much made it clear that they're going to be hosting U.S. nuclear weapons right on Russia's border. And that's not all. Let's look at another article here. This is from Australia's ABC. U.S. Air Force to deploy nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Australia as tensions with China grow. So not only threatening nuclear war with Russia, but also threatening nuclear war with China. And then finally, here is another report that is very concerning from the Associated Press. U.S. general on rare visit to nuclear-armed sub in Arabian Sea. So any rational, independent viewer of these actions can only conclude that the U.S. is threatening both Russia and China with nuclear weapons. This is extremely provocative and it's extremely dangerous. And I think it gives lie to the fact that Russia is this boogeyman, this aggressive, rogue state that is threatening the world. Well, actually, the U.S. is doing its damnedest to threaten Russia and China with a nuclear war. So now that I've established that, Aaron, I just wanted to provide that context there for people who say that we're just going to be apologizing for Putin or whatever. Now that we see this very aggressive posturing that the U.S. has been taking, I just maybe want to get your overall thoughts, what you think about this situation in Ukraine, and then we can get a little bit more into the historical parallels 60 years ago with the very dangerous situation where the U.S. and the Soviet Union came close to nuclear war as well.
Right. Well, nuclear weapons came onto the world stage really at the exact moment that the U.S. empire steps onto the world stage with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were gratuitous and totally unnecessary war crimes. Japan was defeated when Hiroshima was bombed. The only real part of their overseas empire that was left was Manchuria, and the Soviets had already agreed to intervene there, and they would a couple days later, the day before the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Once the Soviets entered Manchuria, they cut through the Japanese forces and routed them and killed, people roughly equivalent or even maybe exceeding the number of people killed in the atomic bombings. So they crushed them. And the U.S. still chose to drop the bombs on them rather than negotiate a surrender with Japan, which would have allowed the emperor to stay on. They knew that was the only stumbling block. There's every reason to believe that the nuclear bombs were a signal to the Soviet Union. And the next year, so Japan surrenders to the U.S., but they had every reason to want to do that anyway, because if the Soviets were poised to invade Hokkaido, perhaps, then they would have just taken away the whole foundation of the Japanese nation state. And they probably would have wiped out the Japanese ruling class. So that was the beginning. And that was the way that Russia perceived it. They perceived it as a show of force for them. And then the next year, if you think that that's dubious, I would encourage you to read the book version of The Untold History of the United States, which is written by historian Peter Kuznick. There's the Oliver Stone miniseries that's based on all of this, Untold History of the United States. I would encourage people to watch episode 3, The Bomb, to really get a great overview of the creation and the use of the atomic bomb in World War II. And if you think that it really wasn't about the U.S. having another tool to pursue empire after the war, consider that they threatened the Soviets the next year, their supposed ally. They threatened them to nuke them if they did not withdraw from Iran, which was not a U.S. territory. It was a British-dominated area. They basically wanted them to withdraw from Iran so that it could return to its status as a British puppet state. So the U.S. from the very beginning created nuclear bombs, and they thought they threatened to use them repeatedly against other countries, and made plans to use them in different places, like in the 1950s over the French. The French were about to lose to the Vietnamese, and they were going to use them in Operation Vulture in 1954 to try to save them at the Dien Phu. They threatened to use them against the Quemoy and Matsui crisis, which was these are islands like near Taiwan. They almost got into a nuclear war with China over that. They had thought about using them at various times. Even when Kennedy had taken office, they had plans in Laos. We just talked about this recently on our podcast, that the generals thought, like, well, let's just send a force into Laos in 1961, and if the Chinese come in and we need to, we'll nuke them over it. So the U.S. has been by far, I mean, they're the only country to use nuclear weapons in war, and they use them against a defenseless city and a country that was defeated already, essentially, and was halfway across the world, no threat to the United States at all. They threatened to use them in 1946. They contemplated using them in the 50s as well, even into the 60s. So the U.S. has been the bad actor that made other countries have to pursue weapons themselves, especially China and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union sets about a crash course to get the bomb as quick as they can, and they're able to get it by 1949, same year that the Chinese Revolution succeeds. And then the Cold War really sets off from there, and the U.S. tries to, use this as part of their arsenal to have basically dominion over the global capitalist system. And part of that was crushing revolutions in former colonies of the world. So Cuba has a revolution, and the U.S. doesn't like this because the Cuban revolutionaries nationalized a lot of U.S. business interests. And so they use these right-wing Cuban thugs that had escaped, that had been part of the U.S. puppet state there before, to try to retake the island with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy was kind of suckered into approving it, but he wouldn't give the military green light to actually join the fight. And so they suffered a huge defeat. But this was scary to the Soviets and to the Cubans. They didn't want this to happen again. So a couple of years later, 1960, a year and a half later, let's say, they decide to put nukes in Cuba. And there we were. There we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a reckless move by Khrushchev, but the whole goal was to prevent another invasion from the U.S., which they always feared. So the part of the way that got resolved was the U.S. said, okay, we will remove missiles from Turkey, and we will make a pledge not to invade Cuba. And that's how it was resolved. Okay, with the situation in Ukraine, is the U.S. doing something I think even more reckless and indefensible than what the Soviets did with Cuba. I mean, in Cuba, you had a revolution that was a genuine revolution. President Kennedy himself said, we have to admit that the cause of the revolutionaries in Cuba was just. Okay, that's a remarkable statement from a U.S. head of state, because it was the U.S. that propped up that Batista dictatorship and all the other ones. So in this case, you had a revolution, and then they attempted to put nukes on the weapons, but this is an unacceptable geopolitical threat to the United States. And so they tried to stop this. They put a quarantine around the island. People in the U.S. around Kennedy wanted the U.S. to invade, and Kennedy wouldn't do it. Thanks to Kennedy and McNamara and Robert Kennedy, so John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, they're able to negotiate a way out of this crisis, and the world doesn't have to come to an end. In the case of Ukraine, this was pointed out by people like Mearsheimer, and even people like Burns and other American statesmen, other officials said, yeah, Ukraine is it would be a provocative thing for us to try to go into Ukraine. Well, they did it anyway in 2014. They staged a coup, a very obvious CIA coup. It had all the classic elements of it, organized street protests. I mean, in Iran in 1953, they had the support of 80 to 90% of the people, and the CIA was still able to negotiate to pay for street mobs in order to carry out that coup. Okay, in Iran in 1953. In Ukraine, it's like 50-50, divided almost, and they spent billions there over many years on democracy promotion and other things to manipulate civil society. So it was much easier to organize these huge protests. and the secretary or one of the State Department officials, Victoria Nuland, was passing out cookies to anti-government protesters. And this is totally, unprofessional for a diplomat, if you believe that the U.S. diplomats are doing what they're supposed to do. And there was false flag violence like there was in Iran in 1953. In this case, in Ukraine, you had these snipers, some of them presumably Nazi guys, CIA assets who were, all of these people that were shot from strange locations, and then other violence to protesters. So you had all the elements of a coup, and you had the U.S. on tape, U.S. officials talking about who they wanted the new leaders to be. It's very obvious. And this was perceived as a threat by Russia. And so Russia quickly moves to allow Crimea to secede and join the Russian Federation, because the Russians immediately recognized that this was a U.S. operation. Since then, they armed Ukraine, especially under Trump. Obama wouldn't do it because Obama said, look, Ukraine is more important to them than us. I don't want to get us bogged down there. Trump actually reverses that policy, even though he's supposed to be a Russian, mind control sex slave or something. I don't really even know what they're trying to say about Trump and Russia anymore. But he reverses that policy. They turn it into a fortress with NATO weapons and other economic aid and so on, right on Russia's doorstep. This is perceived as a huge threat to Russia. They tried to negotiate an end to this for 8 years and were really emphatic about it in December of last year, saying they needed a demilitarized Ukraine, that they had these red lines that needed to be respected. Instead, Zelensky goes to, I believe it was Munich, just a week maybe before the invasion, and is talking about how maybe Ukraine should think about getting nuclear weapons. Well, if Russia wasn't already set on invading, they were going to after that. So that's the situation that we're in. And it is perceived as a proxy war between the United States, or between Russia and the United States set in Ukraine, a puppet state. And the Russians I don't think that they want to destroy Ukraine. They have not really gone about doing a kind of like Dresden-style demolition of Ukrainian cities, although who knows what we're really seeing unfold today as missile strikes start and the ground is starting to freeze. But I think that we're at a position where I'm not a military expert who looks at like the number of tanks everybody has and logistical yada, yada, yada. It just seems like the military force of Russia is much greater than Ukraine could ever hope to muster, up to and including nuclear weapons, which I don't expect Russia to use. But the U.S. has always talked about using nuclear weapons in wars that were much less, in their backyard than this war is for Russia. So it's just madness for these people to have brought us to this point. It seems to me that in order to stop Ukraine getting crushed by this much stronger neighbor, the U.S. would have to enter. And it's hard to see how that doesn't lead to nuclear war. So this is the height of just irresponsibility and kind of imperial madness for us to be in this position. It should have been taken into account long ago, and it was by some people that warned about this, officials and other scholars. Mearsheimer's analysis still holds up very well. And that was pretty much right after the fact, 2014, 2015. You cannot have nuclear war between great powers, and therefore any diplomacy you're going to have carried out in these areas must take that into account first and foremost. These people, we should be furious at our leaders for putting us in a position where you could have a nuclear war either by choice or by miscalculation, because the Russians might be at a state of high alert looking for some kind of nuclear attack and then misinterpret something, and then it could start that way. It could start in a crazy way. So we should be furious at these people. It's not, the U.S. doesn't care about the people of Ukraine, and they're going to get crushed, and it's going to become impossible to say like, oh yeah, we were really, really trying to help them. Already if they keep helping them anymore, there's just going to be a massive crater where Ukraine used to be. This is not the kind of help anybody needs. But here we are. It's scary and infuriating, really.
Yeah, Aaron, you made a very important point that does not get emphasized really at all in Western media, which is that Zelensky, the NATO puppet leader in Ukraine, has repeatedly talked about getting nuclear weapons. Before Russia invaded in February, he brought up the possibility. And since then, he's repeatedly raised this point. And we constantly hear in the Western media, these hyperbolic reports about how Russia is supposedly threatening nuclear war because Putin reaffirmed Russia's nuclear posture, which has always been there. I mean, it's not a new policy. He's not threatening nuclear war. He's saying that Russia, if it comes down to nuclear war, will respond, like it will use nuclear weapons. So he's saying that you can't just destroy us. I mean, that's the position of any country with nuclear weapons, and it's
not the
assured
U.S.
destruction.
position, though. That's not the U.S. position. Is that it may use nuclear weapons to protect its interests or its allies' interests, which is quite a different thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I also want to talk about China's position in a bit. China is actually the only permanent member of the UN Security Council that has a position where it refuses, it will never do a nuclear first strike. But anyway, I want to show here. This is from a really good political scientist. I think he's of Ukrainian descent, Ivan Kachanovsky in Canada. And he was translating. He's a very good resource for people who want to understand what's going on in Ukraine. He speaks Ukrainian fluently. And he, back in October, he shared this article from a local Ukrainian newspaper, which is pro-Zelensky, pro-NATO. And it disclosed that Zelensky called for NATO to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on Russia. It was during an interview with the Lowy Institute, which is, a pro-war think tank. And this is not the first time that he's made these comments. I also want to point out that Zelensky called for preemptive nuclear strikes by NATO on Russia, while at the same moment he was being considered as a top candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. And he ultimately didn't win it, but it did go to a bunch of Western government-funded anti-Russian activist groups. But seeing how flippant some of these Western policymakers and pundits are about the possibility of nuclear war is quite scary. I mean, I began this discussion today looking at some media reports from the U.S. military, but also if you look at the pundit class, like Anne Applebaum is a classic example. She's this hardline neoconservative figure. She's married to the former defense minister and foreign minister of Poland, who himself boasted of the U.S. being behind the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. And she wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine titled "Fear of Nuclear War Has Warped the West's Ukraine Strategy." And basically she argues that the West should not be afraid of Russia's nuclear weapons, that the West should go all in and put everything they can into waging this proxy war to defeat Russia, and that it's all a bluff. So basically saying, like, no, there's not actually going to be nuclear war. I mean, this is extremely dangerous. And then finally, I want to point out another article that was actually published before Russia even sent a single troop in, which I wrote an article about back in February, a week before Russia invaded, which is where this CIA veteran named Matthew Kronig, who worked for both the CIA and the Pentagon, he wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine, again, before Russia intervened in Ukraine. And the title was "Washington Must Prepare for War with Both Russia and China." And he's now a major figure at the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank in Washington. And in this article, I highlighted that he called to threaten non-strategic nuclear strikes on China over Taiwan and on Russia. So this is an extremely provocative. These are very provocative measures that these Western officials are taking, and it just highlights everything that you were saying there about this history of the West being the one that has frequently pushed for nuclear war with Russia. I mean, I'm curious if you have thoughts there just to respond, but maybe we can talk about the situation in 60 years ago in 1962 in October with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where once again, Moscow was portrayed as some kind of crazy aggressor, ignoring the fact that the U.S. had nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy.
Right. I mean, this goes back to one of the foundations of U.S. diplomacy, which is the Monroe Doctrine, which stipulates that the U.S. would not tolerate any colonial expansion in the Western Hemisphere. And by extension, it would not intervene in European politics. Well, as it turned out, the U.S. held pretty true to the, not accepting any inroads into the Western Hemisphere. But after World War II, massive manipulation of politics in the EU Gladio operations, stealing the Italian elections. It goes on, and who knows what goes on today. But so that was the thing was the U.S. wasn't going to tolerate them putting any nukes into the United States. That was deemed very provocative and unacceptable. And Kennedy, who was as opposed to war as you could have hoped a U.S. president would be, really more than you would have ever expected a U.S. president to be at this point, he resisted the advice from all of his generals who called for invading the island, basically, and starting a bombing campaign. What they didn't know at the time was that the U.S., they already had nukes available on the island that were operational, that could be used, these tactical nuclear weapons. So had Kennedy actually listened to the advice of these generals and so-called wise men, he would have sparked a nuclear exchange. The Cubans had authorization to use those weapons if the U.S. did attack the island. And then the U.S. would have responded, and then the Soviets would have responded, and we would have had very likely the end of the world, because you have nuclear winter after the fact, that it would result in so much ash going into the atmosphere that it would kill all the harvests for 10 years, and almost all of the human population would die off. But thankfully, Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to restrain the more hardline people on both sides. And after the fact, Khrushchev and Castro came to recognize this about Kennedy, and had to have more of an appreciation for him, especially Castro. I mean, Castro and Che Guevara was even more gung ho about taking aggressive steps here. But even when Kennedy dies, Castro gets the news because he's talking to somebody that had been secretly sent as a messenger, basically, from the president at the time that the president's assassinated. And Castro says, this is wrong, this is bad, everything's going to change. And it did. The U.S. took a hard right turn, and Kennedy, who had turned down very serious recommendations that he start wars over Berlin, over Laos, putting ground troops into Vietnam, during the Bay of Pigs crisis, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he refused to start a war in all those cases. And so we were very lucky that was the case, because otherwise none of us would be here today. And to go about willfully creating this position is the height of irresponsibility today. But back then, you understand the logic of the U.S. demanding that the missiles be gone. But by international law, they had really done nothing wrong. But that really that doesn't seem to weigh in these issues. So people, when they're talking about these, the realists, like, I'm not a realist myself who thinks that we should just be rule of the jungle and the strong must survive in this world by whatever means is necessary. But realistically, this is the way great powers act. And this is known by the U.S. It's not as though the U.S. empire was governed by not realist logic. Okay, it's not that the U.S. is this liberal enterprise that's governed by like idealism. It's the same sort of, harsh reality of violence and power that is the foundation of any empire, because you have to have that mentality. So you understand why the U.S. wouldn't want the missiles there, and you understand why the Cubans and Russians might want them there. But it had to be resolved, and eliminating the risk of nuclear war should be the top priority of everyone, because nobody wins with that. This situation in Ukraine, we think, why would the U.S. even do this? It's so far away across the world. Why would they stage this coup and look to be turning this into an outpost? It's not, I think, similar to the Cuban case, in that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was an attempt to deter an invasion. And that seems to be largely it. Yes, they probably would have liked to have some strategic, strength that they would get by having missiles that close to them. It might make the U.S. more restrained in some ways, but really it's mainly to deter an invasion. In this Ukraine case, they're doing it to, it's not a country that had a revolution. It's a country the U.S. installed, and it's right on Russia's border. It is seen as extremely aggressive. And so we really ought to look back at how they were able to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis and think about that today. The problem is that you have Russia, who sees Ukraine as a threat to the existence of the Russian nation state. And then the U.S. sees that Russia, with its ability to sometimes intervene militarily, like it did in Syria, that they're a threat to U.S. plans for global domination. So they perceive it as a threat to the U.S. empire, not the U.S. people. this is what Americans, if they're confused about it, if they stop and think about it, why is the U.S. risking killing all of us, even the rich guys, over what happens in Ukraine? Like, especially when these areas in question, like, actually are majority Russian speakers who would like to be part of Russia anyway. I mean, I'm not talking about North and West Ukraine, but like, this is a very strange explanation, and only the analysis of the U.S. as an empire allows us to make sense of it. Otherwise, it's just going to be a silly conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for pretty much any issue in history or political science. If you don't understand that the U.S. is an empire, you can't really understand anything that's happening or that did happen. Now, Aaron, as a historian, as a political scientist, as someone who wrote a history of the U.S. empire, what are the lessons that you think that we should draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago? I don't even like that term, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, it's what everyone calls it. But you could say the U.S.-Soviet nuclear crisis. What are the lessons that we should draw from that 60 years ago? And obviously, this is never going to happen in a million years. But if you were somehow allowed to be an advisor in Washington to, the White House, what would you say should be like the lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis that Biden could learn from someone like JFK?
Well, that you must do your best to have, the political version of sociological imagination, which means that you must be able to understand the position of your adversary and what their incentives are in a particular way, and what they deem to be their red lines that they and what the defense of those red lines would entail. Really just being sensible about understanding the reality of the situation and gaming out responses and counter responses would be a way to resolve this. I think that this is key to grasp to diplomacy, and yet the whole idea of being an empire is that you develop a mindset wherein you disregard other countries' national interests as inconvenient if they conflict with the goals of empire. And so some sort of reckoning about the U.S. as an empire and how it has led to sort of errors in comprehension in terms of dealing with the situation that has brought us to this point, like imperial myths and strategies and doubling down on failed strategies, brought the U.S. to this point, and that now it needs to disengage. And it probably means taking an L in order to avoid the biggest of all L's, which would be nuclear omnicide, the destruction of human civilization in nuclear war. It is just staggering to even to think about that it needs to be explained by anybody talking on the internet. It shouldn't come to this point that we're trying to say, like, how can we somehow make our leaders know that they shouldn't have nuclear war? And I mean, they do issue statements to this effect, but like, it really is, they must step back and appreciate each other's interests and find a way to coexist. And that's the whole experience for the Cuban Missile Crisis. It affected Kennedy in 1963 in the summer, so less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He goes to American University and he says, we need to make the world safe for diversity. We need to have peace, world peace, not just peace in our time, but peace for all time. And I'm not talking about a Pax Americana forced on the world by American weapons of war. I mean, peace for everyone, a world that's safe for diversity. This is what Kennedy was saying in the months before he was killed. And note that it did not come to pass. And so maybe we should look into the forces that killed Kennedy if we want to see, why it didn't come to pass also. That's a separate issue. But the Kennedy, it's sad as his assassination is, and Vietnam disaster everywhere, it's also a story that we should see as hopeful, because we're all still here, because there wasn't a nuclear war. And I believe it was during the Kennedy administration. It may have been Kennedy himself, but he said, one of these generals all have one advantage over us, which is that if we do what they say and then they blow up the world, nobody's going to be around to tell them that they were wrong. That's where we are today. It's going to be cold comfort to me if everything gets blown up, that like, aha, I was right about it being very dangerous. I guess this is madness, and it's people have got to see the other side's position and then go from there and find a way to resolve this without destroying human existence.
Yeah, in our series that we've done together, Aaron, based on your book American Exception, Empire and the Deep State, we talked a lot about C. Wright Mills, a brilliant sociologist, and he coined the term crackpot realism, and that term is more and more relevant by the day. But I want to talk about another important book that we have actually talked about in our series, and that is by Daniel Ellsberg, The Doomsday Machine. I read that when it came out a few years ago, and it was terrifying. It was one of the most scary books I've ever read, because Ellsberg was an analyst for the Rand Corporation who had access to confidential secrets. And actually, one of the reasons that he released the Pentagon Papers is not just because of the lies about the Vietnam War, but even more importantly, because he was afraid of the possibility of nuclear apocalypse. And yet, because of this freak accident, I think like he buried all of these papers like in his brother's backyard or something. I don't remember the story exactly.
But there was a landfill. His brother buried it in a landfill.
And then there was like a big flood or a storm, and they could never find the papers again, right? So he was never able to release all those materials that he risked going to prison over. But in his book, The Doomsday Machine, he discusses, for instance, how the U.S. nuclear system was set up so that if there ever were a nuclear war to break out between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the system was automatic, and the U.S. would automatically nuke China as well, even if China had nothing to do with it. The system did not allow for human input to change it. It was on autopilot. It was going to have nuclear apocalypse against both the Soviet Union and China. I mean, I'm curious if you just want to kind of reflect on those revelations that Daniel Ellsberg made in that book. And I know you at your podcast, American Exception, you've interviewed Daniel Ellsberg to talk about some of these historical echoes in terms of the anniversary of Watergate and many of these, historical echoes that we see today.
Right. The Ellsberg story from the inside, really, the inside of the Pentagon is amazing for a couple of reasons. As you point out, it's abbreviated SIOP, and it was the Joint Chiefs Plan for General War, and it stipulated that if there was anything beyond a small skirmish, you would go to general war, which meant nuclear war, and that not only would this mean launching everything against the Soviet Union, but also against China, because why not? They're allies, and this was going to kill 400 million people, and very, very quickly, and then they didn't know nuclear winter would also follow. So Ellsberg was very alarmed by this, and he made it his mission to try to inform the White House. But the Pentagon had this policy had been created later in the Eisenhower administration, and the Pentagon had a whole set of regulations and policies that were designed specifically to keep the White House from even knowing that this plan existed. Like if there was any document that went to anybody in the executive branch, it was to be scrubbed of it, even the abbreviation, the SIOP abbreviation of the program, or any reference to the actual plan, so that they couldn't ask to see it or anything like that. Ellsberg has to basically be borderline insubordinate, or maybe just insubordinate, and he goes over the heads of his commanders and gets this information to McGeorge Bundy, who passes it on to Kennedy, and they are alarmed by this. They are very alarmed by how insane these guys are. And Ellsberg is charged with rewriting this policy for general war, which he does. He actually does this right before his 30th birthday, which is pretty impressive. But so it doesn't just show you how crazy the Joint Chiefs are and the military men and the people with their fingers on the nuclear button, but it shows you how the deep state can exist and manipulate the public state, and that democracy has a very loose hold on these systems that have power over life and death. And who knows what kind of analogous things there are today, but looking at the sprawling nature of the U.S. military empire, the bases around the world, and then thinking about all of the intelligence outfits and off-the-books operations and cutouts and private contractors we have doing this and that with the intelligence community. Does anybody think that Biden, who seems to be, not quite as sharp as he once was, that he could possibly have a grasp of the totality of the U.S. empire and what it's up to? It's very worse. And Kennedy didn't back in 1960. He told people like De Gaulle said, your CIA is trying to kill me. did you do that? And Kennedy said, well, no, but I don't control those guys, so sorry about that. Whatever he said, but he was basically saying, I'm not trying to assassinate you, but that doesn't mean the CIA is not trying to assassinate you. And that was how it was back then. It's only gotten worse. And this is, Ellsberg gives you a glimpse into this. His other book, Secrets, also is useful in this way. It's more about a memoir of like the events that led up to him leaking the Pentagon Papers. He was going to leak the nuclear secrets. It was actually someone else who advised him to do the Vietnam stuff first, because it's a war that was ongoing and maybe they could stop it. But he wanted to act, he thought the nuclear stuff was actually more important. And it doesn't come out for another 40 years or so. So it's really an amazing story. And Ellsberg's, both of his memoirs are worth reading to get a sense of the culture of the national security state and the different practices of it, and the nature of the nuclear predicament that we're in, because as he makes it clear, it's lucky that we haven't been blown up yet.
Yeah, and we've seen reports more recently from even the New York Times, thanks to Daniel Ellsberg. He leaked them information, and it was reported in mainstream media that in 1958, in the Taiwan Strait crisis, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military brass, they wanted to nuke the People's Republic of China over Taiwan, which is another incredible historical echo, how much things have changed. And to his credit, Eisenhower refused to nuke China because it would have led to nuclear retaliation and nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And of course, it's not just the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's another article that the Washington Post published many years ago. It's called "When Ike Was Asked to Nuke Vietnam," and I shared this on Twitter. And it talks about how the Joint Chiefs of Staff and John Foster Dulles wanted to nuke Vietnam. Here's the Washington Post reporting that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff raised the possibility of using nuclear weapons to save the French at Dien Bien Phu. And also they point out here that John Foster Dulles, the brother of Allen Dulles, the founder of the CIA, both of them Wall Street lawyers. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State. The Washington Post reported here that Dulles, speaking about nuclear weapons at a restricted NATO meeting later that month, said, "Such weapons must now be treated as in fact having become conventional." So another incredible historical echo. This is them speaking in a NATO meeting, and John Foster Dulles says nuclear weapons are now conventional. And he also added that, quote, "Our concept envisions a fight with nuclear weapons rather than the commitment of ground forces." And that this would not only involve nuking Vietnam, but also nuking China. So this history really needs to be understood, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretaries of State, top U.S. officials have not only supported, but have actively lobbied for, advocated for nuclear bombs, the use of nuclear bombs against China, against Vietnam, against the Soviet Union. Honestly, it's a miracle that they didn't destroy the planet. And before we pivot, Aaron, here, the last question I wanted to ask you about is something you alluded to, nuclear winter. Now, in the 1940s and 50s and up maybe into the 60s, it wasn't really well known scientifically that if there was extensive use of nuclear weapons, it would likely annihilate all life on Earth, because it would release so much soot into the air that sun couldn't go through, which meant that plant life would die. And of course, with the circle of life, that means that animals would die, agriculture would die, and people would starve to death, right? So it's widely assumed by most real scientists and experts today that there cannot be an extensive use of nuclear weapons, because quite literally billions of people would die, if not all of human civilization. And yet we've even seen a few op-eds here or there. I think this is part of like the madman theory, where like the Washington Post will allow a few of these insane neocons in Washington to write an article saying, we should rethink the nuclear winter thesis. A limited tactical nuclear war could be possible. Can you respond to this insanity, claiming that a limited tactical nuclear war wouldn't risk annihilation of human civilization?
Well, the most charitable reading of those comments is that they are purely for signaling, what they call signaling in game theory and IR, that you're signaling to your adversary that you have resolve and are committed to, defending your position in the conflict or whatever. But that is, even by that reckoning, when you consider that this isn't a conflict of like the U.S. versus Russia and the integrity of or survival of either nation state, that it's really about, empire, then it becomes totally unconscionable. And this, so I don't, they have to know this. They can't be that stupid. You actually can explain mutually assured destruction probably to a 7, 8, 10-year-old. I mean, not whatever. You could be a kid and understand this. So what is really going on here? Presumably, hopefully, this is just posturing to act to send some signals to somebody. I don't even know what, because if it does happen, none of it matters anyway. That's the joke of the whole thing. You're talking about a course of action that if it does happen, we're all going to die. And this is quite easy to understand. So why would it? It's the height of irresponsibility for them to even platform people making these arguments at the Washington Post. I mean, I don't really like what sometimes gets called as like cancel culture or whatever, and like trying to like stop views that you don't like from ever being heard. But I really would be fine if if the media all decided we will not platform people who are advocating for nuclear war, no matter what position they have at this or that establishment think tank. So it's pure madness. But if you notice, if you go to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the people that keep the doomsday clock, there was a recent article there. I don't read them religiously, but the one time I did look at them recently, there was an article and it was all about the nuclear taboo. And they had written out of the entire story the long U.S. history of threatening people with nuclear weapons and of nuclear of people in the military brass advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. They totally put that out of the story. So they're putting out an idea of like, oh, there's this nuclear taboo, which there is. The U.S. hasn't dropped them on anyone since World War II. But the U.S., this is not something that the U.S. willingly accepted. It was kind of foisted on the U.S. over time and by convention and by the fact that U.S. leaders, as crazy as they were, even LBJ and Nixon, they didn't use nuclear weapons. And so this eventually led to some kind of enough restraint that the U.S. has sort of stopped talking about using them as a regular weapon of war. But this was not nuclear policy at all. So for the U.S. to act like the way the U.S. is spinning it, and even BAS, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which as I understand is now headed up by somebody with more establishment connections in the past. So that would kind of explain it. But the idea of nuclear weapons as a perfectly reasonable bargaining chip in international diplomacy, if not an actual viable weapon in military terms, this has long been a part of U.S. policy. And this history needs to be understood as well, and needs to be brought into the common understanding of people so it can help us to resolve this conflict without all of us dying.
Yeah, and I just want to recall that when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the British Labour Party and was the most popular leader of the British Labour Party, which is why they had to destroy him and crucify him, he was constantly condemned by the media, this just warmongering media, for refusing to endorse the possibility of a first strike. And he also said that not only would I not do a nuclear first strike, I would never use nuclear weapons as prime minister. And he was just excoriated for that. But I do have to point out here, just while we're wrapping up this segment on nuclear war, that in his speech at the United Nations General Assembly this September, the foreign minister of China, Wang Yi, deserves credit. He emphasized in his speech, I'll just play a brief clip here, that China in its constitution says that it pledges to keep to a path of peaceful development and will never have a first nuclear strike. This is what he said at the UN.
China is the only country in the world that pledges to keep to a path of peaceful development in its constitution. It is the only one among the 5 nuclear weapon states that is committed to no first use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so I mean, it shows that countries can. Sorry, the lighting is screwed up. I'm going to fix it in a second. The sun keeps moving in my window, but it shows that there are countries that have responsible leaders who are willing to pledge not to use nuclear weapons and destroy the planet. And it's really sad that that these Western governments are just governed by these maniacs.
I mean, the way that China and Russia are described as a whole is just is absurd. The fact that China is being packaged as this nation with plans for world domination, and they have like maybe one military base outside of their own territory, something like that, and they have not attacked a country for quite a long, gone to war with the country. When they did, most recently, it was on their own border. It was very limited. So, what is it that the U.S. is even? The reason that the U.S. perceives China, for example, as a rival and Russia as a rival. Russia rivals the U.S. the ability to dominate everything militarily the way that it wants to. So it's a threat to the U.S. empire. And then China gives countries another partner to do business with and so on, so that they don't have to do everything the U.S. says. Those are the threats that are represented by these two countries. And for the U.S. people that have run the U.S. empire without any real competition for a long time, this is apparently really horrifying to them. But if you are a person who cares about human existence, then you would need to root for the end of the U.S. empire and a new system where international law is more or less respected, national sovereignty is more or less respected, and countries aren't free to dominate and exploit, massive swaths of the global population just to keep making the rich people richer.
Very well said. And yeah, China has one overseas military base in Djibouti, and it's part of United Nations anti-piracy operations. So I think that was a great discussion. Thank you, Aaron. It's always very enlightening to hear your analysis and what we should learn from these past historical episodes like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want to pivot a bit and mention the other topic that I had brought up at the beginning of this stream, and that is OPEC and the 73 oil crisis. Now, today we are in a massive global energy crisis, and it's being compared to the energy crisis of the 1970s. We've seen today that oil prices have skyrocketed to over $100 per barrel. And of course, a lot of this energy crisis has been fueled by the Western sanctions on Russia. Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of both oil and gas. And of course, the US has sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, which are two other very significant producers and exporters of oil and gas. So this is an energy crisis that was largely created by U.S. foreign policy. But we've seen a lot of analysts compare the energy crisis today to the 1973 oil embargo that OPEC had. And the conventional narrative about this 1973 oil crisis is that it was a response by the Persian Gulf monarchies, specifically by Saudi Arabia, in protest to Israel's Yom Kippur War with several different Arab nations, and of course, the US-backed Israel. And the narrative is that after the Yom Kippur War, Saudi Arabia responded with this oil embargo of Israel and the Western powers that sponsored Israel. But you, Aaron, have actually done a lot of research on this, and you have argued that that narrative actually is very misleading, and that in many ways it was actually the US government that wanted the OPEC oil embargo. Let's not forget that quite literally overnight, when the OPEC oil embargo was declared, the price of oil more than doubled. And then later, in the later 1970s, with the Volcker shock, the price of oil skyrocketed once again to over $100 per barrel. And I did a recent discussion with Radhika Desai, a brilliant geopolitical economist, and we talked about the similarities and differences between today and the crisis, the third world debt crisis in the 1980s. And of course, the OPEC oil embargo in the 70s, which led to skyrocketing oil prices, and the Volcker shock, which led to U.S. Federal Reserve interest rates to skyrocket to almost 20%, which meant that countries that had their external debt denominated in U.S. dollars and had their currencies devalued against the U.S. dollar were trapped in all of this unpayable debt. So that historical episode was very important. The 73 oil lockout, the Volcker shock, and the 80s debt crisis. Professor Radhika Desai argued that there's a lot of differences today, that it's not exactly like the 1980s. People can check out my interview with her to get her view. But anyway, the point is I wanted to have all that context here to come back to you, Aaron, and say, indisputably, that historical moment was monumental in shifting the global political and economic system. It came right after the end of the convertibility of the US dollar to gold In 1971, Richard Nixon took the US dollar off of gold, which meant that it was a freely floating fiat currency. And people have suggested that maybe that's one of the reasons that the US wanted this oil lockout, but that OPEC led. Of course, Saudi Arabia was a US ally. It was a way, right at the time when the US pressured Saudi Arabia to sell its oil in dollars, creating the petrodollar system. It was a way to strengthen the US dollar as a floating fiat currency and to increase international demand for US dollars. So that was my long introduction for historical context for people who don't know. What is your take on the 73 OPEC oil embargo, and what do people get wrong about it?
Well, it is this whole angle of the dollar, really the rise of the current system that we live under, which I sometimes call the Rumpelstiltskin dollar regime, because of the power that it gives the U.S., which is to just create, instead of having, being restrained by your gold reserves, the U.S. can create as many dollars as it wants, and the rest of the countries in the world take it and use it for international trade, because that's the position that the U.S. has. But it was a change from the Bretton Woods system, which existed until 1968 or 71. It officially ended. And that had the dollar at a $35 for an ounce of gold. And the U.S., because it was spending too much money on military, especially, started running into problems with this. It was a problem under Eisenhower. Kennedy made it a huge part of his foreign policy. He even told people in 61, I'm not sending soldiers into Vietnam because it's going to explode the deficit. The U.S. balance of payments position, and I'm trying to end this gold drain, periodically. So, and finally, Kennedy's policies by the end of 1963, for the first time, the U.S. was actually in gold surplus, and it had really shored up the system. And in October of 63, there's a memo saying all our plans are to be withdrawing from Vietnam by the 1965. So that doesn't happen. Instead, you get the Vietnam War. And military spending basically busts the U.S. balance of payments position. And it becomes clear by 1968 that the U.S. is going to lose all of its gold because it's been spending so much on the war. These dollars are piling up in other countries' central banks, and they want gold for it. And so the U.S. finally says, we're going to shut this down. In 1971, officially, they shut the gold window. And they need to negotiate a new international system, and they're in the process of that. But that was really more of a delay, sort of a holding exercise of the U.S., because while they're negotiating how the IMF and special drawing rights might be used to somehow get this new system, and it won't be just about the dollar, you had the oil crisis being ginned up. And it was talked about by people at this Bilderberg conference beforehand, which is kind of a CIA established thing. I think it was Marshall Plan funding that was used to help establish this group, or at least the Prince Henry was one of the conduits for Marshall Fund CIA dollars that were secreted away. And he set up Bilderberg. So go figure. But the result is by 1973, the outcome is you do have the beginning of the oil crisis. And the oil minister of the Saudis said, yeah, I went to the Shah and he asked me, why are you against this? The U.S. wants this. Henry Kissinger asked me to raise the price this way. So the Shah, the Saudis are saying this. One of the other main actors is Suharto, who is the head of Indonesia. The U.S. installed him. He's another one of these big oil producers during this time. They basically agreed that they would, and it was also in response to other incentives, which is an increase in the price of grain and so on. And so they raised the price of oil and yada yada. But really, the U.S. approved it, and it was to deal with the U.S. problem of the dollar overhang. And all the main countries were allies of the U.S. that were really behind it. Even the Israeli side is one of the belligerents in the Yom Kippur War. Israel is a U.S. ally. The Saudis are a U.S. ally. Egypt, who was a participant in that war, was a U.S. ally. And then the oil-producing countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia especially, are U.S. puppet states, more or less. So the idea that those Arabs are just sticking it to us. But it's the U.S. always told those countries what to do, and even installed their governments, pretty much, especially in Iran and Indonesia. So, the main story is ridiculous. I'd love to take credit for being the person who discovered all this, but there's older books by Robert Sherrill, a book called The Oil Follies. And then a guy named John Blair, he wrote a book called The Control of Oil, and they lay all this out. There's a Guardian article that interviewed the Saudi oil minister at the time that tells his side of the story. And that was the way that it got dealt with. So by the time you get this oil crisis that really takes place, and it starts, moving all these excess dollars to these Arab states or to these oil producing states, this is how the U.S. solves the dollar gap problem. So the dollars that had been in these countries' banks and they wanted gold for them, instead they get spent on oil imports. And then the oil producing countries have all these dollars, and the U.S. says you can either cycle these into petrodollars or put them in Western banks. And that's what they do with all these petrodollars. At that point, those loans are made to developing countries that are not doing so well because of the oil crisis. It's like making it more expensive for them to run oil, and then they're able to export less because the U.S. economy isn't doing as well. So they start taking out loans, basically created by all of these petrodollars in Western financial institutions. Now, the final part of all this chicanery is Paul Volcker raises interest rates really high, and it's harmful to the U.S. economy, but it's devastating to these countries in the global South and also in Eastern Europe. Poland in particular, Yugoslavia, they took out loans during this time period. They because they had taken out these loans to help deal with the problems of the 70s. When the interest rates get really high, combined with the economic problems, less trade, this is a catastrophe. It's the debt crisis. And then all of these countries have to basically submit to IMF restructuring, which allows the U.S. And the countries in the U.S. empire and other capitalists who are under the umbrella of the U.S. empire to take over developing economies and really wreck these countries and plunder them. And this is the source of America's super prosperity. A big part of it in the 80s and 90s is that the U.S. has the ability to make as much money as it wants out of thin air. Other countries accept it. Other countries can't earn enough dollars to be in this system without running into worse and worse debt. So they have to submit to the IMF plans to basically restructure their economies and allow for more plunder from the West. And so it was a very predatory move, and it was more or less like an economic war of Wall Street, the United States against the world. And they were able to pull it off because they owned all of the oil producing centers were in the U.S. orbit and could be told what to do by the United States. That's not the case today. And that's where this is a big part of why we may see a shift in the whole system, because the U.S. doesn't control the oil producing regions of the world the way it did before. Not only is Russia a huge producer, but the Saudis are like basically telling the U.S. to piss off, as we saw recently. And additionally, these other countries that may end up having problems because of energy and other economic issues could potentially go to China for help and become closer to China rather than having to deal just with the U.S. and the IMF and all of its dictates. So we're in a shift similar to what we saw in the 70s and 80s. Well, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? It's really not completed until Reagan, a year or so into Reagan's presidency. But the difference we're seeing now is I don't believe the U.S. has the fundamental control over the structure of the international economy to reproduce its victories of this era. I think that we may well be seeing the end of U.S. unipolarity as a result of this. And a lot of it comes down to kind of boring economic issues and payments issues and energy costs and things like that. But the U.S. the U.S. doesn't seem to be in a strong position. And by trying to isolate Russia and failing and isolate China and failing, the U.S. may actually be hastening its own demise, even as it desperately tries to hold on to its empire. And that desperation is why the nuclear issue, we can tie these things together. These things are related. These things are the precarity of the U.S. hold over the international political economy is the key structural reality that should make us very concerned about the prospect of nuclear war, because the U.S. really is fighting to hold on to being world history's most powerful and richest empire.
Very well said. And I really think that the 71 Nixon shock, the 73 OPEC oil embargo, and then, of course, the Volcker shock starting around 79, going up to the third world debt crisis, which really began in Mexico in 1982 and Argentina. And then it spilled over into Thailand and Brazil and many other countries. I think that decade, those events or was really a watershed moment. Maybe you can even say, Peter Dale Scott might call it a kind of deep event, a series of deep events, especially when you know the role of people like Henry Kissinger and elements of the U.S. national security state involved in some of these events. And of course, the creation of the petrodollar, which came at the same time. That is such an important historical period that is not very well known, but you can't understand the world that we're living in today and the collapse of that economic order that was created. We can talk about Bretton Woods, which we still live with elements of Bretton Woods, specifically with the IMF and the World Bank, right? But actually, the IMF and the World Bank's balance sheet right today is lower than it was at that peak. The peak really was in the 90s when all of those countries in the third world debt crisis, especially after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, they had no alternative. The US was the unipolar hegemon, and a country that had balance of payments issues basically had no choice unless it wanted to be under a total blockade like the DPRK or Cuba, right? There are a few exceptions, but even I constantly talk about the classic example of South Africa. You had this glorious struggle against the apartheid regime led by the ANC and leaders who were very revolutionary and leftists and even communists, like Nelson Mandela, who was allegedly a member of the Communist Party of South Africa. And yet, when they come to power and overthrow this colonial apartheid regime, they have no option but to impose neoliberalism, right? Not because he was an ideological neoliberal, but because that was the international political and economic architecture at the time. And all of that is coming apart at the seams today. I mean, you talked about one of the key issues, not only with the rise of this multipolar world with new financial institutions. China has banks that are lending for infrastructure projects and even balance of payment issues. The BRICS system, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also Saudi Arabia saying that it's going to potentially list its oil in the Chinese yuan. Now, Saddam Hussein, one of the reasons, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but one of the reasons for the 2003 war in Iraq is that Saddam was selling his oil in euros, refusing to sell them in dollars because of the Western sanctions and, the oil for food program. He created this scheme using like euros and Western banks to sell oil in return for the oil for food program. Of course, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Again, I'm not saying this is the only reason. There's never one single reason. It's not like the war in Syria was only about a pipeline, although that was a factor, right? But Muammar Gaddafi, one of the reasons for the NATO war that destroyed Libya and murdered him was he was trying to create a gold-backed Pan-African currency. Like, it's not just some like crazy tinfoil hat idea that the U.S. empire fears threats to dollar hegemony. No, that's a very real political factor. That's one of the ways that the U.S. empire can maintain its hegemony is through the power of the U.S. dollar, which is still used in a majority or at least in a plurality of international trade.
It's in the longer telegram, which is the Atlantic Council's manifesto on China. That's in their executive summary. One of the bullet points is we must not allow the U.S. dollar to be replaced as the global reserve currency. So even their mid-level flunkies understand that now in the U.S. blob of foreign policy or whatever.
Yeah, I recently wrote an article at Multipolarista about an IMF report that was warning about the use of the U.S. dollar in the foreign exchange reserves of central banks around the world, and how the holding of U.S. dollars is at the lowest point in over 20 years. And that continues to decrease. And then you have the rise of what they call non-conventional or non-traditional currencies, specifically the Chinese yuan. So this is all a huge part of this international financial and economic and political architecture. But I'm wondering if you think that moment in the 1970s, with this creation of the petrodollar, the oil lockout in the 80s, I'm wondering if you think that maybe we're in a moment today that could be similar. Of course, I'm never trying to ask you to tell the future, but that moment in the 70s leading up to the Volcker shock and the debt crisis is really what led to the international dominance of neoliberalism. Like I said, it wasn't just adopted willingly by countries around the world. It was adopted because they had no other choice. And you had the rise of structural adjustment programs. It was it was the third world debt crisis that led to the IMF actually coming in, because let's not forget, all of those petrodollars that were recycled into US banks during the 1970s, when the oil prices were skyrocketing, those dollars were recycled into US banks, and then they were given in extremely low interest loans to the global south for infrastructure projects. And then, of course, when they were unable to pay back in the 1980s because of the Volcker shock and the high interest rates and the devaluation of their currencies against the dollar and the overvaluing of the US dollar, what happened? The IMF stepped in order to negotiate on behalf of all of the US commercial banks. And then that's what led to the IMF becoming hegemonic, because in the future, from the 1980s forward, any commercial bank in the US that gave loans to a foreign country told that foreign country that they had to be approved by the IMF, that they had to have their macroeconomic conditions approved by the IMF, which means structural adjustment. Do you think that maybe today we could be seeing another kind of deep event like that leads to the creation of a new kind of financial architecture?
Well, I think that it's a structural event. Peter's definition of a structural deep event is that it comes from a part of the clandestine state and results in greater secrecy and so on, and deals with covert operations that were already in existence. But I think that the broader idea that this is a kind of a deep political phenomenon, something that is not understood and is typically suppressed rather than discussed, you could definitely have a concept of an economic deep event, and economic deep events, and the issue, the collapse of the Bretton Woods, of the dollar, and the replacement with this Rumpelstiltskin dollar regime is a kind of rolling deep event of sorts. That's more or less what I lay out in American Exception, and I think I bring some new things to the table, and I tie it back to the creation of the military-industrial complex too, right after World War II. But as far as where it is going and what we're going to see, it does look like it's either going to be a shift towards multipolarity and some kind of international law or a system to manage things more closely in line with international law than we had before once things shake out. And that the U.S. may have to dial back its plans to be the global hegemon. It looks like Europe is headed for a terrible winter, and I don't see how the Ukraine situation, I think that it's going to redound to the detriment of the United States, and that it's going to bring Russia and China together more so. And the fact that China is also having to deal with the U.S. trying to do something similar in Taiwan, it seems like the U.S. is trying to bait the Chinese into doing something reckless and dangerous with Taiwan. Maybe that was why they provoked them so much with Ukraine. The thought that if Russia just went in and rolled over Ukraine and occupied them, maybe they'll get into a longer war after the fact. But that Russia would look so bad that you could really recast them as a pariah that countries shouldn't do business with. But Russia didn't do that. So maybe that's why Russia didn't do that. Maybe they've been outplayed by the Russians who not taking the bait, but also not allowing Ukraine to become this full-on NATO fortress. I don't really know exactly what they were saying, because these things take place at a higher level that I don't have access to. Obviously, I don't even know what the U.S. government is doing, much less Russia. But I don't see how the U.S., if they don't have a nuclear weapon, that they're going to be able to reverse the decline of U.S. hegemony, because all of these countries in the global south, and really these countries in Europe, everybody has the populations have every incentive to want to break out of U.S. domination. And this Europe, it wasn't always this way, because they kind of enjoyed a bubble of prosperity, in part because of their being a privileged sector of neocolonialism, that the U.S. basically absorbed all of their colonial holdings in other countries and their invested capital in other countries, and they sort of were the guardian of that. And so Europe is able to be artificially prosperous based on exploiting the global south, so similar to the U.S. But now with these energy problems coming up, it's going to become clear to Europe, I think, that the U.S. hegemony is no longer in their interests. And then where do they go from there? The main overriding goal or one of the major ones of going back decades and decades, really even before World War II. It's a part of why World War I was even fought. Is this fear, that the British and U.S. fear of Russia and Germany being allied. I mean, they hated this idea. There was a prominent German statesman in the interwar period who was essentially assassinated for advocating such things. You see that they just blew up the pipeline in the supplied oil, or oil from Russia to the Germans for German industry. I mean, they really are freaked out about this, but the logic is it makes perfect sense. It's just there's so much propaganda in Europe and Germany and everywhere else that's made to support the imperial status quo. But as things get bad, there's going to be more and more people saying, this isn't working out for us anymore. What's the U.S. going to do at that point? I mean, I think that Europe is headed for a rude awakening, and we're already seeing more protests about this. And the global South has not joined in with them in this quest. So who's really going to even support the U.S. through this as we go forward? I don't know. I mean, if the U.S. can pull a rabbit out of its hat and save its position as the global hegemon, I mean, I will be surprised, but I don't see how they can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't either. I think, who will be going along with them? It's going to be the countries that are economically dependent on them, like Europe, potentially maybe Japan, maybe South Korea, which are still militarily occupied by the U.S. Although even Japan, actually, the new prime minister of Japan just had a meeting with a top Chinese diplomat and pledged that he wanted to boost Japanese integration with China, which is a pretty significant development. Of course, this comes after Olaf Scholz took this trip to China, where he said that there's a multipolar world and that Germany doesn't want to be dependent on China, but doesn't want to break relations with China. And that was him trying to show that he's independent. Although at the end of the day, if Germany's going to commit economic suicide and rely on extremely expensive U.S. LNG, then he doesn't really have many economic options.
I mean, how many U.S. troops are in Germany right now?
Yeah, exactly. Tens of thousands. So this gets me to the final issue that I wanted to raise today in our discussion, which is a historical event that I think you could also consider kind of an economic deep event. And that is the 2014 oil crash. I want to show a graph here of oil prices since the 1960s, because I think what's interesting is if you look at the prices of certain commodities in international markets, especially oil, you can kind of get a historical map of major deep events or historical events. So in the 1960s, of course, this map is crude oil prices, and it's adjusted for inflation, of course. And if you look in the 1960s, adjusted for inflation in today's dollars, oil prices were pretty low, around $20 to $30. And then, of course, in 73, you have the OPEC oil lockout, and quite literally overnight, oil prices skyrocket from below $30 to over $60. And then you have the Volcker shock around 79. Oil prices skyrocketed to, in early 1980, $144 per barrel. And then throughout that period, as the U.S. gradually lowers some of those very high Fed interest rates, you have oil prices, they lower a bit, although they're still very high. And then you can fast forward and you can go to the 2008-2009 financial crash. Oil prices skyrocket once again. And I should point out that in the 2000s, you had this major boom of commodities. And that was actually one of the reasons that allowed countries in the global South, especially in Latin America and Venezuela and Brazil and Ecuador under Correa and Lula and Chavez, they were able to ride that wave of the commodities boom and fund social programs to fight poverty. I mean, actually using that money for the first time to benefit their own population. And then you have in the 2010s, for the most part, you still had very high oil prices, but then something happened in 2014, and you saw a massive plummeting of oil prices that never really recovered. And then, of course, in 2020, you have the COVID pandemic, and oil prices skyrocketed because of the decrease in demand. And that brings us to today with the proxy war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion in February, and prices skyrocketed to up to a peak of around $110 a barrel. And it's fluctuated mostly around there, a little lower, but $80 to $100. What I want to talk about is a historical event that's not that well known, which is here in 2014. Around September 2014, oil prices went from $125 a barrel and they crashed to $60 a barrel. And then a few months later, they crashed to $40 a barrel. And this is not just the vicissitudes of the market, right? There's this idea that neoliberal economists have that, like, the free market, you just have to listen to the market, right? I listen to all these financial analysts on YouTube, and they always talk about what the market says. The market says this, the market says that. And it's like, no, the market is not some, omniscient, thing with its own spirit or whatever. Like it actually is responsive to geopolitics. And this reminded me actually of a Twitter thread that I remember engaging with you in back in 2021. And this was with one of our mutual friends, Our Hidden History, who unfortunately, I guess, deactivated to detox from social media. But
good for him.
Yeah. But you had pointed out, the reason I wanted to get at this Twitter thread is I think you said it very well, that if humanity survives the end of U.S. dominance, this episode, and you were talking about this 2014 oil crash, will be recognized as one of the most irresponsible acts of the crumbling empire. And I pointed out that it's not that well known, but this 2014 oil crash was orchestrated by the Obama administration. And there were articles in the time in Reuters and also the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times about how John Kerry, who was U.S. Secretary of State, took this trip to Saudi Arabia, ironically on 9/11, on September 11, 2014. And they were just talking about oil prices. And basically, this is when King Abdullah was still in power, before he died. And this is before we had King Salman and then his son, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's now officially in charge. And he's clearly much more independent and is much more interested in playing, China and Russia against the U.S. But anyway, this is back when King Abdullah was in power. And what happened is that, according to these media reports, the U.S. made an agreement with Saudi Arabia to overproduce oil, to massively overproduce, which of course drops the price of oil in the global market. And this was in response to a few things. One, this is right after the U.S. and Europe imposed sanctions on Russia over the annexation of Crimea, which of course was in response to the U.S. orchestrated coup in Ukraine in 2014. And of course, there was a democratic referendum, and even Western pollsters have admitted that over 90% of people in Crimea who were historically ethnically Russian and spoke Russian wanted to join the Russian Federation. So one of the targets of this oil crash was Russia, a major exporter of oil. So the U.S. and Europe imposed sanctions on Russia as part of the first hit. And then the double tap strike is they crashed the price of oil to try to crash the Russian economy, to try to bring about regime change. That didn't work, obviously. Another target was Venezuela. Hugo Chavez died in 2013 after contracting a very suspicious, very aggressive form of cancer. I've talked to many Venezuelan government officials who thought that he was targeted with some kind of advanced technology, a weapon. He dies in 2013 after very rapidly developing cancer. And then there's an election, and Maduro comes in this narrow margin. The U.S. at first refuses to acknowledge his victory. And then in 2014, they initiate a coup attempt backed by the U.S. and Venezuela right around the same time, using the so-called guarimbas, which are these violent barricades to try to paralyze the country, which were then repeated in Venezuela in 2017 and in Nicaragua in 2018. So Venezuela also never recovered economically from that oil crash in 2014. And then in 2014, the Obama administration imposes sanctions on Venezuela. And then in 2015, the Obama administration declares Venezuela an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States and leads to more and more sanctions. And then another country that was also targeted by this oil crash in 2014 was Brazil. Brazil was a major oil exporter, and it relied on the Workers' Party government, relied on oil to fund its social programs. And this leads up to the 2016 soft coup against President Dilma Rousseff. But I remember in 2014, with the crash of commodity prices, because of course, when oil prices crash, other commodity prices also tend to crash. They go along, they tend to go along with each other. And this led to massive protests against the Workers' Party government in Brazil. And looking back at those protests, they were very suspicious, and they had elements of like the Brazilian oligarchy, the people who would become Bolsonaristas. And also, I think it's fair to say that to speculate that U.S. intelligence was involved in those protests in 2014 against Dilma Rousseff, which set the stage for the 2016 coup against Dilma Rousseff and the series of coups that led to the election of Bolsonaro and the imprisonment of Lula. So anyway, the point I'm getting at here is this is something that I've thought about a lot over the years. I've always wanted to like do an article or even a short book about that 2014 moment, because I think the 2014 moment was similar to the 1973 moment of the OPEC oil lockout, and that the U.S. was trying to, and then also Iran. This is also when the U.S. is trying to pressure Iran to join the nuclear deal. And by crashing the price of oil, the U.S. can pressure Iran economically, whose economy is reliant on oil exports, to come to the table to sign the Joint Comprehensive Nuclear Plan, the JCPOA. So the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So anyway, I mean, I've kind of answered my question already, but the point I wanted to get at by spelling that historical episode out is that it seems very clear to me that in 2014, the U.S. intentionally crashed the price of oil by using Saudi Arabia to overproduce oil. And then it did so targeting Russia, targeting Venezuela, targeting Brazil, and targeting Iran. I'm curious if you have further thoughts on that, and if you think that maybe that's another kind of deep economic event that's comparable to the 73 oil lockout.
Oh yeah, I think that this was part of a plot, a U.S. policy at the time to weaken this. It's really a broad and ambitious plan, and I think it didn't achieve what it was supposed to achieve. But it's easy to get the logic of it. As you point out, you have, the oil prices are higher if the supply is higher. The supply is high, the price is low, and vice versa. If the supply is low, the price goes high. So the U.S., all of those things, among the ways that this happened was, as you point out, U.S. officials visiting Saudi Arabia with that old king on the throne still at the time, and they really lower prices. And there was actually, and then they agree, they say, okay, we'll lower the prices. Although that part was mostly left out of the coverage. It was mentioned sometimes, but oftentimes the coverage of why the Saudis were doing this was it was explained.
Syria.
Well,
right?
It was
Syria.
It was explained also as a way to capture market share because the U.S. had just brought a whole lot of oil online. And this is the part that I write about in the book, where I think I actually do add something based on a couple of sources, and I don't flesh it out extremely well, but I think it's one of the things I put in the book that I haven't really seen elsewhere, which is that this was a geopolitical strategy born in part by quantitative easing. So it's the way that quantitative easing allowed all of this capital to be floating around. It's channeled into fracking operations that are not very lucrative, especially as the price of oil goes down. And so the Saudis are saying, oh, well, we're just doing this to try to make sure we get market share in the long run from these U.S. producers. Well, why did Kerry go over there and then encourage them to do that policy if it's really aimed at harming U.S. oil producers? That doesn't make any sense. So really what I would say happened is the U.S. put a full court press on crashing the oil price using its leverage with the Saudis, saying, keep pumping, pump, pump, pump. Oh, and now we will also pump a lot of oil as well because we created the capacity to extract a lot of oil in ways that don't even really make sense based on the market and the actual value of oil and how much it costs to extract. But we don't care because we can create credit out of thin air and allow that to be channeled into investment in hydroelectric fracking or whatever, or fracking. And so they could basically turn the U.S. into a big oil producer with using all of the magic of the Rumpelstiltskin money machine and quantitative easing, which is essentially just money printing in different ways of just creating money and buying up debts and improving the balance sheets of banks and so on by taking on other assets so that they have more liquidity, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this was a part of that story. And in Brazil, I would have to guess that a major part of it was not just all of the vaguely socialist or social democratic policies of Rousseff, which he continued from Lula, but also the issue of Petrobras, the Brazilian oil company, which they've been trying to privatize for ages, right? So I think that was part of the gambit. They're thinking we could wreck this Brazilian leftist-ish government, and then eventually affect the privatization of Petrobras in the long term. We can weaken Iran, we can weaken Russia, we can weaken Venezuela by doing this. And so I believe that was absolutely a kind of economic warfare when they really decided to step it up against some enemies of the U.S. that they had perceived, which are like the Brazilian people who want to have some oil revenues, and the Venezuelans who'd rather build homes than make Standard Oil more money in profits or whatever. Like, these are the enemies, and that they used this as a weapon. It was a way for the U.S. to try to, as they did in the 70s, use control over oil and the global financial system as a means to strengthen the U.S. empire. But I don't think it succeeded, and I think that it's what's happening in Ukraine and how it's kind of like risky and dangerous, and it seems headed for a kind of disaster in Ukraine. It's just the desperation. It's like these other methods of trying to reproduce U.S. hegemony perpetually have failed. The Project for a New American Century, the 9/11 wars, the quest for full spectrum dominance, the Arab Spring Wars, trying to remake the Middle East that way. These all failed. We're stuck occupying part of Syria totally illegitimately, and we just shrug about it. And this Ukraine war is a total disaster. And it's pretty hard not to admit that the U.S. has really wrecked this country since getting involved there in 2014. But, underlying these are the international political economy and the exorbitant privilege of controlling energy and finance, and really food as well, which the U.S. has enjoyed and is a big part of its, the imperial system it's created. And it's kind of fallen apart.
Yeah, this whole historical episode of 2014 is so important, I think. And you're right that when it was reported in most media reports, they talk about it as if Kerry was going to Riyadh just to talk about Syria. And what's hilarious is the argument made, the New York Times had an article about this, and they said that Kerry went to Damascus, Kerry went to Riyadh to talk about Damascus, to talk about Syria, and to pressure Saudi Arabia to increase its oil supply. And in return, Saudi Arabia pressured the U.S. to send more support to the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, as if the U.S. needed to be convinced by Saudi Arabia to send more weapons to these Salafi jihadist head choppers trying to overthrow the Syrian government. I mean, so clearly it was a very suspicious meeting, but it also reminded me of this interesting documentary that Al Jazeera produced back in 2019 about Saudi Aramco. And of course, this is at the moment where Saudi-Qatari relations are at the worst they've ever been. This is after the Trump administration pressured Saudi Arabia to blockade Qatar, and Al Jazeera is just churning out anti-Saudi propaganda. So we understand why Qatar produced this documentary. But it's a very interesting documentary. I'd actually recommend it. It's called Saudi Aramco, the Company and the State. And there's this very interesting part where they have this guy named Jim Crane, and they just describe him as an expert on energy policy and geopolitics. And he kind of dispelled it. I remember I was watching this a few years ago when I was thinking about the 2014 oil crash and the U.S. hand behind it. And he makes these comments here where he just confirms exactly what we were talking about how one of the key aspects of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which I guess you could say has really deteriorated in the past few years. But one of the key points is that the U.S. can use oil as a geopolitical weapon by pressuring Saudi Arabia, which until recently was just a total U.S. client regime, to overproduce oil to crash the price of oil in the global market. He says it very clearly. I'm just going to play this clip here. It's very interesting. I think I should have, I have the audio here. So let's listen to these comments here.
Production capacity that they don't use. Okay.
So
no spare capacity per day. Saudi Arabia
is
addressing the global market's needs for reliable supplies of petroleum.
Saudi Arabia is the keystone in OPEC. It is the big dog. It's the ringleader, if you will, within OPEC. OPEC members maintain a little bit here and there. None has more than 1 million barrels per day of spare oil production capacity that I know of, but maintains that kind of level of spare capacity at, as a policy. Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco typically maintain, 1 million, 2 million barrels, 2 million barrels a day of oil production capacity that they don't use. Okay. So no profit-oriented firm would ever do this, right? You wouldn't invest all the billions in developing oil fields and pipelines and storage facilities and production infrastructure and then just leave it dormant. Saudi Aramco has done it at the behest of the Saudi state. And, it's the key aspect in the Saudi-U.S. partnership, Aramco's ability to bring more oil production online and its willingness to cut back at times when markets are oversupplied. It's kind of the crux of the U.S. and Saudi strategic partnership.
Saudi Arabia.
So I remember that's from 2019, but I remember seeing that and I was like, well, there you go. Confirming exactly what we've been saying, that Saudi Arabia historically has had this possibility to overproduce or underproduce to change the price of oil in the global market at the orders of the United States. And that is how the US empire was able to use oil as a geopolitical weapon, although now that's changed. The situation has fundamentally shifted. And the fact that, one, Saudi Arabia has a leader who apparently is not just a complete US puppet. Not that I'm praising MBS, as some great leader. He's got so much infinite blood in his hands from the war in Yemen, which ironically the US pushed him into waging for these since 2015. But, the point is that Saudi Arabia has always played such a key role in this US imperial system. And the fact that the U.S. could be losing Saudi Arabia, I don't think it's going to become an enemy, but as an asset that the U.S. can boss around, and that Saudi is potentially becoming an independent geopolitical player, it takes off the possibility of the U.S. to control the price of oil on the global market. And if Saudi Arabia starts selling its oil in the yuan, even if it does still continue selling it in the dollar as well, if oil becomes diversified in global markets and it's listed in the yuan, it's already being basically sold and bought in the Russian ruble, because Russia has set up the scheme to force countries that buy oil and gas from it to pay in rubles using the Gazprom Bank. And that's a fundamental shift, and that is one of the fundamental pillars that U.S. hegemony was predicated on.
Yeah, John Perkins wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he also goes into detail about this and the way that the oil thing functions. And he was in an interesting place, a position where his job was to go around in the 70s to go to these third world, developing countries and say, take out this loan from the World Bank or from whatever, and it'll help you. So he had a role in this system earlier, and the idea was to get these countries to take out loans that would not be really repayable. It would get them in debt, and then that could be used as leverage by the U.S. later on. So he was also, and some people said, oh, you're making this up or whatever. And I think at some point he was threatened to be sued by like Bechtel or one of these companies. And then he's like, well, I have all these documents, and so if you want to do that, let's do it. Discovery will be really interesting. And then there was this old footage of him with Greg Palast or something back in the 70s or the 80s on public access television or something, or public television, where they're debating whether this municipality should like take a loan out to like upgrade its electrical grid or something. And Greg Palast was saying like, don't do this. You're going to be sucked into this debt trap, yada, yada. But Perkins was there making that kind of a case as a hired, economic analyst. So he does seem to have been doing what he says he was doing. And he also talks about being a part of the Saudi, what he called like the Saudi money laundering deal, which was a way to rearrange where the petrodollars would go in accordance with U.S. geopolitical interests. And part of the leverage that the U.S. had over the Saudis was to say, all right, somebody is out of line or something. One of these oil producing countries is producing more than we would like, or they're out of line, something. So for whatever reason, just please crash the oil price. And then the Saudis would do that. And when Reagan takes office after the tumultuous 70s, and even parts of his term are kind of difficult at first because it's still being hammered out. But the Reaganomics and the miracle of Reaganomics, or the economic upswing under Reagan, was really, it rested upon interest rates going way down and oil prices also going way down. And these are things that the president doesn't control. These are things controlled by the pinnacle of economic power in the United States, the Federal Reserve and the bankers that pretty much command the Federal Reserve policy. And then oil policy is just the oil majors, and the oil majors in the oil producing countries, how much they're going to produce. That's the oil price. So really Reagan could say, oh, Reaganomics, look, this supply side economics must work because look at how good the economy is doing. But oil prices and interest rates were these two huge things that were really top down. The deep state essentially is controlling these levers. So it just shows you how it's not a democratic thing, and that we need to understand the way that statecraft operates in this day and age. And this era of, or the role that the Saudis play in this is huge. And if you want to understand like why this Khashoggi business even happened, why he's chopping up guys that are friendly to the U.S. and seem to want to reform the Saudis, well, they have reason to, because he's charted some independence. He is not liked by the United States, and Khashoggi was seen as an actor who was loyal to these other elements that could potentially be used to do regime change in Saudi Arabia. So, it's the game. That's how the Game of Thrones is played. If somebody's trying to overthrow your kingdom, chop them up or whatever. That's not how I handle problems in my life. But I'm not a monarch of a oil kingdom. So that's how it goes. But yet the fact that it's changing and that the Saudis are basically like being publicly defiant of the United States, this is just one more piece of evidence or one more data point as we look at the general decline of U.S. hegemony.
Yeah, you mentioned Khashoggi. I mean, that's a name that constantly comes back, a family name that constantly comes back in the discussions that we have, Aaron, because it's a family deeply involved in U.S. intelligence circles. Adnan Khashoggi, who is the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed. He was the Washington Post columnist, Jamal Khashoggi. His uncle, Adnan Khashoggi, was a billionaire arms trafficker. We've talked about him in our interviews. He was a CIA agent, or asset at least, working closely with the CIA. And I have said publicly, I've gone out on a limb and said that I highly suspect that Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist, was obviously working with U.S. intelligence as well. He was working in the 1980s in Afghanistan. He was helping to convene the so-called Arab Mujahideen. So the Mujahideen originally started out as Afghans, right? So the Arab Mujahideen were the international Arab volunteers, also funded by Osama bin Laden, another CIA asset. And Jamal Khashoggi was working with so-called Arab News, which is a Saudi state media outlet. And he was just doing propaganda on behalf of the Mujahideen and the CIA and Pakistani intelligence, ISI, and the Saudi state. And then later on, Jamal Khashoggi started working a lot with Mohammed bin Nayef, who was a clear U.S. intelligence asset who worked closely with the U.S. government. And Mohammed bin Nayef was supposed to be the next king, but he was purged by Mohammed bin Salman, and that led to this rivalry. And then you had the former CIA director, John Brennan, went on MSNBC, and he said that Mohammed bin Salman is a cancer in the royal family that needs to be excised in order to go back to our special relationship with the Saudis. So, I mean, I have a whole other podcast and video about all of that, about Khashoggi and everything. But, that's one of those names where once you understand how these figures play into U.S. intelligence circles, then you can start understanding what's actually going on behind the scenes, and how the killing of Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi, obviously as reprehensible as it was, I'm not endorsing it, but it was clearly the reason it was so amplified in the Western media 24/7 is, one, because Turkey and Qatar were using their soft power to try to amplify this, because it was a way of them to geopolitically to get back at Saudi Arabia over its blockade of Qatar. So they were using their media soft power, like Al Jazeera. And Turkey itself, this was in the Saudi consulate in Turkey where he was killed. And Jamal Khashoggi's wife, his partner, was working with the Turkish government and also with the Qatari monarchy. So they were amplifying it. But also at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that he was a U.S. intelligence asset, and Mohammed bin Salman killed a U.S. intelligence asset. And then this is at the same time when he's getting closer to the Russians. There's that famous video of him high-fiving Vladimir Putin. So, and then of course there's also the Sochi Olympics and all of this. So this is all, the point is that if you want to really understand what's behind all of these stories in the media, you just have to look at the deep politics and the geopolitics of it all. And that's why I was really grateful that you could come on, Aaron. It's always a fun discussion. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
Well, I do. This is a plug, I guess, but I also think it may be helpful to people. I lay all this out in the book, American Exception in the Deep State, the way that the U.S. laid the financial, monetary infrastructure of this U.S. empire, and the dirty tricks, the covert operations and so on are a part of this tale. They're a major part of the empire that we've created. And we need to understand that empires go the way of all empires. The U.S. empire is going to fall. We are part of an empire, and we need to really come to grips with what this means. And let's hope that the all of the tumultuous years we've been living through, that this is going to give rise eventually to a multipolar system, and that this may offer good chances for American domestic politics to be improved also, because this regime is really the infinite money that the oligarchy has in the United States is why they're able to totally dominate domestic politics too. And if this changes and America becomes a normal country, it may cause some economic hardships in a while, but it's also more hopeful. I feel like the U.S. empire is the greatest threat to human existence at this point, and that if wishing for its end is what you should do if you are an American who cares about America, or if you're a human who cares about humanity. Either way, this empire, if you're not part of this anointed oligarchy of a tiny percent of the population, it's really much doing you more harm than good, and it's threatening your life and the life of your children and everybody with nuclear death as they attempt to hold on to this. So I'm always happy to get to talk about these things, Ben, and you do a great job here with taking in a lot of different information from different parts of the world and packaging it in a digestible way. So I appreciate you having me back on here.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you, Aaron. It's always a pleasure. That's obviously why. I mean, I always enjoy collaborating with you. I think we're doing work in a similar vein, and I appreciate everything that you do. And I would highly recommend everyone watching or listening to go check out Aaron's book, American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. You should buy the book, and then you should read the book and follow along in our series. In the description below, I have a link to the American Exception, Empire and the Deep State series that I'm co-hosting with Aaron. And we started with the theoretical discussion of imperialism and the deep state, and we're currently going through the history, going back to the creation of the U.S. empire and talking about every single different U.S. presidency leading up to today. So, I mean, Aaron is the go-to guy for people who want to know the history of the deep state. I mean, I've said this many times. I think Aaron is up there with Peter Dale Scott as the leading historians and scholars on the U.S. deep state. No one else comes close. And Aaron, any other final things you want to plug before we conclude?
No, that's it. I appreciate what you're doing out there, and I'm glad that you've got a loyal audience of people that are interested in these things. And I would also just say on a personal level for people, don't get overwhelmed and despair about these things, because I think that we do realize how powerless we are to do anything domestically in the United States, and that's related to this issue of empire. And so we need to be anti-imperialists. And if we want to fix American politics, we need to end the American empire. And even though that's probably going to happen because of international events, the more people that understand this domestically in the United States, the better for when we finally do have the opportunity to move politics in a better direction.
Well said. And for people who didn't catch the beginning of this, or who want to have a more digestible version, what I'm going to do with this episode is I'm going to, of course, I live streamed it here, but we're going to make it into two parts. And the first part is going to be about nuclear war, the threat of nuclear apocalypse, the U.S.-Russia proxy war. And the second part is going to be about oil as a geopolitical weapon and OPEC. I want to thank everyone who joined in the chat. It was really vibrant, really good chat. I wish I could have responded to some of the questions, but Aaron and I were having a great discussion. Hopefully next time. I do want to thank all the people on Super Chat, like Juju's Jazz Clinic. Good, interesting name. And let me find the other Super Chats here. So many comments. It's always great to see like a good debate. I want to thank Miling Wee, always a great Super Chat supporter. Let's see who else. So many comments. Just 1 second here. Anyway, thank you to everyone who donated in the Super Chat. Thanks to everyone who commented. If people want to support Aaron's show, they can go to patreon.com/American Exception, and they can follow Aaron on Twitter. I have his Twitter account in the description below. And I think with that, we'll probably wrap up here. So thanks a lot, Aaron.
All right. Thanks, Ben. I'll see you soon.
Yeah. And of course, everyone should check out the Empire and Deep State series. We'll have another episode coming very soon. I'll see you all next time.